Welcome, everyone. I see folks are joining from the waiting room. We're glad you're here for our special Women's History Month Perspectives lecture today, and we'll get started in just a few minutes. And I'll say this again in a few minutes, but we really appreciate you joining us. And as you have questions that come up while Katie is speaking to us later on, you can use that Q&A box. You can also use the chat if you'd like to share something with everybody. But we'll have time for questions at the end of Katie's discussion. We'll just wait a few more minutes for it to get to be noon and let everybody in from the waiting room. Alrighty, we're just waiting for more folks to be able to join from the waiting room. So I'll welcome everybody formally in a minute, but just want to draw your attention to the chat. We've got a question in there that we would love for you folks to answer if you'd like to share your thoughts with us. See folks joining, and we'll get started in just a few. Great seeing some of these names come in the chat, folks that I don't know about yet. Thanks for sharing your ideas with us. All right. Welcome to today's Perspectives speaker series with the Utah Historical Society. My name is Catherine Ketterman, and I manage the Women's History Initiative for UHS. And so we're especially excited to welcome you to this Women's History Month installment of Perspectives speaker series with Katie Nelson. I'll introduce her in a minute, but we just want to make you all aware of the offerings and resources that Utah Historical Society has for Women's History Month this March. We'll put a few links in the chat, but one event that we have coming up next week is a Women's History Month trivia night at Memorial House, the Preservation Utah headquarters in Salt Lake City. So we'd love to see you there. It's Wednesday, March 26th at 6 p.m. And also, if you go to our landing page that's been put into the chat for Women's History Month, you can find our digital resources, including a bingo card that you can play along, get 5 in a row, and send in a response to our form, and we'll mail you a sticker sheet, as well as finding out about other resources and events around the state. So we hope that you'll join us for one or more of these celebrations. Um, and now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Just as a reminder of the format of this talk, we'll hear from Katie for about 45 minutes. If you have questions as she's speaking, please drop those in the Q&A box, or you can also add things to the chat. And then I will moderate a Q&A with Katie at the end, so you'll be able to have those answered. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Katie Nelson. So she has a PhD in history from the University of Warwick. I probably said that wrong, or not like a true British person. She's a Utah native world historian and author of What's Her Name? A History of the World in 80 Lost Women, which was just released in the US just a few months ago. After years digging into Ogden history for the Weber County Heritage Foundation, Katie has become a diehard advocate of Ogden's largely forgotten global history. She hosts the acclaimed women's history podcast, What's Her Name? 3 million downloads in 160 countries, which is pretty amazing. And she also leads history tours at home and abroad. And Katie has taught courses in history and the meaning of life at Weber State University for 15 years. We are thrilled to have Katie with us. I have been on some of her tours and enjoy listening to her podcast and have loved reading her most recent book. So we're just going to give the time over to you, and we're along for the ride.
Thank you, Catherine. That's how I feel. I'm just along for the ride also. Never had a plan for my life. Here I am. How did I get here? I don't know. But pretty fantastic ride so far. Let's see. I have slides to share with you. Let's see if it works. Got some mostly just pictures of historical women because I personally am a visual learner. Here we go. And I love to be able to see what I'm listening about. So what I'm going to talk about today is just putting with the women back in world history. This has become a passion of mine. And like I said, I kind of sort of came at it sideways, I would say. I am a historian from Utah. As Catherine said, I got my undergrad at Weber State University, my master's at Utah State University, and then off to England for my PhD. I lived on the coast of Massachusetts in various places, but returned back home to teach for 15 years. And over the course of those years, I taught courses in pretty much everything. I think that's one of the greatest things about being on the bottom of the totem pole is that you have to teach the classes that nobody else wants to teach. So I got to teach every kind of subject across all time periods across the world. And I taught world history for 15 years, ancient and medieval and modern. So I got to learned a lot. Basically, I was still in school for all these years. And somehow that turned into a podcast. And my co-host is my sister, who is a professor in women's and gender studies in Colorado. And so a project together, I guess, just was inevitable. And we created this podcast called What's Her Name? Here it is. If my slides will move. There we go. What's Her Name podcast tells the stories of women that history left out. And we started that maybe 8 years ago, thinking, who will listen to this? This is not just women's history, which is hard enough to, sell to people, but it's a podcast which tells the stories of the forgotten women of history. So not the famous queens or famous inventors, but the women nobody has ever heard of. And the good news is that people want to hear about it and that there is a massive audience for it. And that's one of the great surprises over the last 8 years, millions of downloads across the world. And our numbers guy will just, text us every couple of mornings and be like, you're number one in Estonia today, or, Peru, number one today. And it's just so surprising. Comforting, I guess, rewarding and thrilling that the world is ready and eager to hear the stories of women who got left out. So that turned into a book Four books, I guess. We just finished the fourth book of basically different world history books. One about sisters through history, one about toilets across time and across the world, and one about women in history, 80 lost women. So this is the one that just came out. Here it is. It's through Michael O'Mara Books, which is a UK publisher, but the US edition just came out a few months ago. So today, I think in 45 minutes, I guess what I would like to share is my own takeaways from 7 years of doing women's world history. And the podcast is global in scope. We cover all time periods and all places across the world, as is the book. And one of the most delightful things about this project for me is discovering how many incredible stories there are out there. I think we will never stop uncovering incredible tales from all walks of life, from the richest and most powerful to the poorest of the poor. And the more we do it, the longer our list becomes of potential subjects. One of the things that really expands the scope of the podcast, I think, is that typically we don't even know about the women that we feature before we create an episode, or indeed before we put them in this book. And my general strategy is to just find experts in any field, find the expert and go to them and say, is there a woman in your field that you think deserves more attention than she gets? And as we've seen in the chat, the answer is always yes. And that in itself is so inspiring. No matter the field, no matter the time period, experts in that field are like, yes, well, there's this woman that nobody ever talks about, but in fact, she's really incredible. And so that's often how we find our subjects, or we have publishers that approach us a lot because new biographies are coming out. So, the good news about the history of women in the world is that the work out there is being done. We have endless emails flowing in from publishers about new biographies that are coming out. There is so much out there, and there has been so much done over the past 10 years that there are endless possibilities for how to construct a history of the world through the stories of women. So a publisher approached us, Michael O'Mara Books approached us and asked us if we wanted to write a book written sort of based on the podcast. And this is the challenge that I set myself, I guess, as a world historian who's read and taught a bazillion textbooks about the history of the world. I thought, this is a fun challenge. Is it possible to tell a relatively complete history of the world? Obviously, no one can tell a complete history of the world. It would take a million years. But could you tell a relatively complete story that hits all the major episodes of world history using only the stories of forgotten women? And once I had that idea, then I was like, yes, I will write this book. This is an intriguing challenge, which I will certainly enjoy. And what I found was, not only was it easy to do, but it was thrilling. And the way that the history of the world, the way the big overarching narrative shifts in just intriguing and beautiful ways when you tell it through characters that all got left out the first time. It's really amazing story, I think. So my 5 major takeaways, I guess, that I will share today. What I want to do is just to tell you some of the things that I've learned over the course of these 7 years doing women's world history, and then also just intersperse stories of women from the book and stories of women from, well, we'll start with Utah, because it's the Utah Historical Society. Just a very small handful of examples of some of these stories that have that we've written into the book, and that have really brought the human story to life. So how I went about it. A lot of people ask me that. How do you go about writing a history of the whole entire world and then filtering out 80 women? How'd you choose the 80 women that you chose? Here's basically what I did. So I was the historian of the two of us, and Olivia is the women's studies professor. So I did all the overarching historical framework and everything, and then Olivia would select out biographies to write within the overarching narrative. Um, so what I did was, well, I mapped out my chapters. Okay, we're going to have 10 chapters. And over the course of those 10 chapters, we're going to tell all the major episodes that I personally want to cover. And of course, every world historian would be different. They would choose different major episodes. That's what makes it so fascinating. That's what makes world history so wonderful. But these are the 10 that I chose. My favorite things to talk about in the history of the world, and the moments that I think are the most significant and the most thought-provoking. So got to cover the Stone Age, of course. And then I tried to give an impression of what this chapter is going to be about with these subtitles. So this is my best way of summarizing the story of the world. This is the 10-second version of the book. The Stone Age. Ancient humans build elaborate stuff out of stone, but why? Chapter 2, first civilizations. Humans build cities. Weirdly, men are in charge. Chapter 3, ancient empires, keeping up with the Romeses. Chapter 4, the Middle Ages. Nothing can stop Asia's domination except one little bacterium. Chapter 5, the New World. America enters the chat. Absolutely everything goes bananas. Chapter 6, land grabs and the Enlightenment. The world plays an epic game of risk and solves everything. Chapter 7, liberty enlightening the people. Or maybe not. The world grabs liberty and runs in every possible direction. Chapter 8, Global American Saga. By hook or crook, the whole world piles into America. And this chapter 8, this is where Utah makes a surprising appearance as a place of global significance in the 19th century in America. Chapter 9, Sticking It to the Man. Down with the man, if you could just point him out for me. And chapter 10, The Atomic Age. Is this the end? The whole world takes stock. So that is my overarching global narrative of the history of the world. And each one of these episodes is full of the stories of women who either played hugely significant roles in these moments in time, or even their life experience was emblematic of the time, and just studying their life brings to life the whole entire era that they were living through. And we actually had a spreadsheet. We were selecting the 80 women to include because we wanted to make sure that we were offering up as much variety of the human experience as possible. And so on the spreadsheet, there were things like not just geographically, where did this woman live, but what was her experience about? Is she a warrior? Is she an artist? Is she an athlete? Is this a scientist? Is this a philosopher? All those kinds of things, in order to select out women whose collective stories would assemble almost like a chain through time and take us through a beautiful overarching narrative of what the human story is. Here's what I learned in the process of writing this book, and I guess over the course of creating the podcast also. When we zoom out and look at the big picture, I think humanity's most incredible creation out of all the amazing things we've done, which is a lot of amazing things, are the most amazing thing is our collective story, especially when you look back through time and connect the dots, create a narrative where everything is connected. How did we get here today? Why are things the way they are today? Well, all we can do is look back. And there are so many incredible stories in our own past, and when you connect them all together into one beautiful arc, it is an amazing, amazing story. Okay, so my top 5 takeaways from doing women's world history. One of the things that I definitely know for sure, this is one of my abiding truths now. In any moment in history, in any time period, in any story, finding the women in the story immediately gives you 2 things. One thing is it makes for a much more lively tale. find the women in the story, I virtually guarantee it's going to be more interesting. Things are going to get wacky, things are going to get wild if you add the women back into the story. And the second thing is that so often in episodes in history, as they're presented, say like in history textbooks, I've seen so many world history textbooks over the decades, because all the publishers will send them to professors, to try to get you to adopt it for your classes. So I don't even know how many world history textbooks I have read. And there are many major episodes in human history that have, in my opinion, unsatisfactory explanations. And in those instances, I've found that if you zoom in and you go digging around just a little bit, find the women in the story, then the plot twists make a lot more sense. So let me give you two examples of these. The first one, finding the women in the story, makes for a much more lively tale. This is one of our Utah representatives. She's in the book, and she was introduced to me by a Utah historian, Valerie Jacobson, who maybe is here today. I don't know. She still works in the field in Utah. And Maud Fitch is a character who makes World War I much more visual, much more fascinating and complicated, because the story of World War I mean, it's one of the things that I hate teaching about it, because it's so tragic. It's one of the worst things that ever happened because of the mechanized industrial death. And we all know that. I mean, as historians, we all know the general narrative of World War I. But if you add in the perspective of Maud Fitch, a girl from a mining town in Utah who wanted to go help but wasn't allowed because she was a woman, you could join the Red Cross, but that was it. She wasn't a nurse. She had driving skills back when cars had only really recently been introduced. She said, "I'd like to drive an ambulance." And they were like, "Well, sorry, little lady, we can't have you involved. We can't have women out there in the field. What would happen? You can't handle this kind of stuff." And all these women who wanted to drive ambulances and persist until finally the US government agreed, okay, well, you're allowed to join if you pay for your own room and board. Oh, and all your labor is voluntary, of course. You're going to have to supply your own ambulance and all the fuel for your ambulance. And you're going to have to pay to ship the ambulance and all the fuel to Europe. Then we will allow you to volunteer and help. And even with all those roadblocks in place, she did it. She purchased her own ambulance, shipped it to France, got the fuel there as well, even when there are so many obstacles where people are trying to steal it or commandeer it. She got there just to help, for free. She wrote letters home, and the letters home are so vivid. They're some of our best resources for women's experiences in World War I. But I think the value of her letters is that often, we're doing things like reading All Quiet on the Western Front, or, we're reading soldiers' letters home. We're seeing the war from the perspective of soldiers, which is vivid and invaluable, obviously. But when we also can add in, it's almost like a film. If we can shift cameras and see it from multiple perspectives, when we add in Maud Fitch's perspectives, the stories of the ambulance drivers who go to the front, pick up the guys who have all just been gassed, and they drive for hours and hours and hours across a desolated landscape and they're on 36 hours with no sleep, and they're driving through roads that have been bombed out. She talks about once when her ambulance gets stuck in this, probably where a grenade had blown a hole in the road, and it was a pool of blood, and she has to get these guys to the hospital, and she's like down in the mud, shoving her own ambulance, trying to get it out. All of that aspect of it, especially that she volunteered for this and she's on her own dime, it adds so much to the story that just makes it even more of a human tale, especially when she talks about talking to the guys that are in the ambulance. She's not allowed to touch them because they're contaminated with gas. She's trying to comfort them, but she wants to hug them, but she can't. There's just so much to the story that she adds in the whole overarching narrative of World War I. Just really remarkable character. So I'm sure because we're in the Utah Historical Society, we all already know about Maud Fitch. But now she is in this world history. So I hope the whole world will know more about her. And I used her story to talk about World War One, and that whole industrial mechanized death episode in the book. Here's an example of the second point that I made, that sometimes weird plot twists, unsatisfactory historical explanations suddenly make sense if you add the women back into the story. And this is the story of the White Lotus Rebellion in China in the late 1700s. In my textbooks that I used in my classes, the story of the Qing dynasty is one of stability and strength. The Qing dynasty lasted from 1644 to 1911. That's a long 400 years. And so generally in the big picture, it's presented as, well, this is a really stable and successful empire. And then because we have to simplify things, we say, like, yeah, there were rebellions, there were all constant little, bubbling rebellions and revolts, but the Qing Empire constantly succeeded in smashing those, almost like a game of whack-a-mole. So the Qing Empire is so powerful and so successful, if any rebellion crops up, they just whack-a-mole through the centuries and they're stable and secure. But then along comes the White Lotus Rebellion in the late 1700s, right at the same time as the American Revolution, which is not a coincidence. And historically speaking, it's often presented as sort of the beginning of the end for the Qing Empire. And the textbooks say, usually, I remember this because it was so sort of unsatisfactory to me. The textbooks say, well, what happened? How come they were successful for so many centuries? And then this broke the cracks in the empire. And the explanation is usually that there were a lot of bureaucrats in the government, and probably they were siphoning away money from the military, and it's like vagaries like that, like, oh, it just kind of got too big, and there were maybe corrupt bureaucrats, and yeah, that's what happened anyway, and then it all broke down. And I always found that kind of unsatisfactory. Then in researching this book, I was digging more into the White Lotus Rebellion. What is this movement? What is it happening at the exact same time as the American Revolution and the Haitian Revolution and all these ideas about liberty that are exploding across the global scene? Are they connected in any way? And as soon as you zoom in on the White Lotus Rebellion, you find this incredible woman, Wang Kong-er, excuse my pronunciation, an amazing character that you would only really expect to find in a movie. She's from central China. She was in the circus. She was an acrobat in the circus. And she met this rebel who was this dashing young guy who's going to start yet another one of those rebellions against the Qing Empire. So she joins him. And they stage this rebellion. It is smashed by the Qing Empire, like every other revolution before was smashed. And as the emperor's men moved through central China, they identified all of the rebels and executed them. They passed right over Wang Kong-er because she was a woman. They only executed men because only men were, relevant, were deemed to be characters that could have made any historical effect. And so her husband was killed, but she wasn't. She was left standing because she was a woman. Shouldn't have done that. She became the leader of the movement herself. She's famed as a warrior leader. She was always described as an incredibly charismatic warrior who had a sword in each hand, unstoppable on the battlefield. And she recruited women into her armies and just went on the hunt. She's slowly going to work her way from central China over to the emperor's capital city, and recruiting thousands and thousands of women as she goes and training them up in the army. This movement is more than just your average rebellion. She is offering women in Qing dynasty China an alternative that they have never had before. And often when textbooks talk about women in Qing dynasty China, they'll say something like, okay, women have two choices in this system. Either Their feet are bound, and they are a status symbol in the home, and their job is to be sweet and domestic influence, and literally unable to walk, and that makes your whole family more of elite status. So you have that option, or you're a peasant working without end in the fields all day. So those are the only two options for women: either, bound feet and stay sweet in the home, or endless manual labor. But this movement, the White Lotus Rebellion in Hong Kong, comes along and says, unbind your feet, women, join the army. I will teach you how to fight, and we will stand up for liberty. And she believed that the number one enemy of enlightenment, and the Enlightenment movement was going on globally at the same time, the number one enemy of enlightenment was the emperor, was this authority and oppression. And she said, once we oust the emperor, then we can establish real liberty and real equality and real enlightenment in China. So no wonder women joined by the thousands, and men too. And it was just this massive movement steamrolling its way all the way to the capital of the empire. In the end, it's a long story, which is amazing. In the end, her movement was destroyed, and the last dozen or so of them grabbed their banner and jumped into the sea. But so it's so interesting because she lost. But this rebellion, the White Lotus Rebellion, is usually pointed to as, oh, there it is. There's the moment. That's the beginning of the end for the Qing Empire. This is where the emperor showed his hand, that he couldn't stop that steamroller all the way up to his capital city, that he couldn't whack-a-mole these people out of the way. And yet still the textbooks persist in saying, probably because bureaucrats maybe were siphoning away some of the money. That's probably why they couldn't oust this particular rebellion. And they never talk about what the rebellion was about, or who was behind it, or why they were fighting. But I think any woman in the world, if you'd say, well, these rebels were offering equality, military training, telling women to unbind their feet, that enlightenment was on the horizon, gender equality, that's what this movement was offering, then I think it becomes obvious why this was the one that began the breakdown of the Qing dynasty. She's just a fascinating character that so the story doesn't make sense without her, and the story doesn't make sense without what was behind this movement and who were the warriors. They don't even mention that this is thousands of women who are fighting against the Qing dynasty. But then it makes sense, then the beginning of the end for the Qing dynasty makes sense once you add her back in. Okay, number two, take my time. Okay, number two, there is no set cast of main characters in world history. And I think this is wonderful. There are so many people who have lived in the past, and there's so many different people who've had an effect. So history, especially world history, it's an endless pool, and you reach in and you tell the stories of these different cast of characters. And as historians, I think I probably don't even have to explain this to historians, because it used to be history was told almost all exclusively in terms of diplomats, it was kings and queens, and, that's history. But then with the social history movement that came along, like we all know, there is no set cast of main characters. You can tell any episode in history from any number of perspectives with any number of people in the spotlight. My favorite example of this is the story of Eve. Eve was enslaved at the Peyton Randolph House in Williamsburg. And I learned about her story by, for the podcast, going to Williamsburg and interviewing the historical director at Williamsburg. And she told me that her favorite story is the story of Eve. We don't have any known images of her. The Peyton Randolph House, for Americanists, you already know what a big deal this is. Peyton Randolph is one of the founding fathers, and at his home, this is it in the background here in Williamsburg, the great and the good gathered to debate liberty. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, all these people are there sitting around the table debating liberty, debating King George, and unfair taxes, all of those things as the American Revolution is about to kick off. And I am just so amazed every time I imagine the reality of this scene, that they're all sitting there around the dining room table at the Peyton Randolph House, and there is Eve, the personal slave of Betty Randolph, enslaved in the house, standing at attention in the dining room, serving these people as they debate liberty, as they debate whether King George is treating us like slaves or not. She hears it all, and she hears all these conversations before anybody else, almost before anybody else in America. I mean, she is aware of what's going on because she is hearing it all go down in real time in the dining room of the Peyton Randolph house. She hears them debating liberty. She hears that King George also claims to understand liberty and be the main advocate of liberty. And there she is in this unique position as an enslaved woman, hearing all the arguments about liberty and thinking, well, when and where does this apply to me also? She lived through the whole of the Revolution at the Peyton Randolph house. One of the most amazing episodes in early American history, I think, is when the rebels declared war, declared independence from England, right here in Williamsburg, just down the street from the Peyton Randolph house. Just a few steps was the governor's mansion of Lord Governor Dunmore, one of the more eccentric characters in American history. He's a Scottish Highlander who famously decorated his governor's mansion with weapons. I mean, this guy was such a character. But when he heard that America had declared independence in the name of liberty, he said, "Liberty, huh? Two can play at that game. Is that what this is about? Liberty?" And he declared a proclamation. Long story short, it's the Emancipation Proclamation, 75 years before the Emancipation Proclamation. He frees all the slaves that are owned by rebels. And he says, "Get to me, enslaved people, you're free. Get to me and I will get you out of here. Or you can join the army and you can fight the people who enslaved you. You can join the British army." So he remained a loyalist to the British and said, "I free all the slaves owned by the rebels. Get to me and we'll get you out of here." So every single slave in the Peyton Randolph house and everywhere else in Virginia and across the colonies has a decision to make. Do we trust this guy? If we run away and we get to him, are we really going to be freed? Or is this all a ruse? And they had to have had so many conversations about that. Eve also, who's going to leave and who is going to stay? Do you trust this guy who decorates his mansion with weapons? Or do we trust Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, who we've heard speaking around the dining room table? She didn't leave, but thousands did. At least 2,000 slaves from Virginia got to Lord Governor Dunmore, and he did what he said. He did what he promised. He put them on boats and took them to Canada, or they joined the army. But they couldn't have known that. They couldn't have known who to trust. So she remained enslaved over the course of the Revolutionary War until 1781, when we know Cornwallis took Williamsburg. And so the British troops are marching down the streets of Williamsburg, and she's standing right outside front of the house and sees the British. They've taken the city, and she says, this is 5 years from Dunmore's declaration. She says, does his declaration still apply? Can I be free? And she just walked out the gate, and she joined the people following behind Cornwallis's troops and seized her freedom and walked away from Betty Randolph's house. I think seeing the story of liberty, the debates all about it, the American Revolution, and everything to do with it, when you see it through Eve's eyes, it just takes on a life that it doesn't in any other way. If anybody understood liberty, it was Eve. And if anybody understood all the debates and all the risks and everything surrounding it, and she met every one of the characters involved in this huge moment in history. Her story is, to me, so moving and fascinating. I wish she was at the center of the story of the American Revolution, because she adds so much to the story. Okay, third point, women, of course, were the villains too. And my favorite of all the female villains in history. Let's do some trivia. So there's trivia night on October 26th of this month. And so they asked me to include some trivia today. This is fun without dedicating too much time to this. Maybe just quiz yourself in your mind. Who's the most prolific poisoner in human history? Of course, it's a woman. You might expect. Her name is Huyemi. Fabulous photograph of her. You can almost feel the creepy evilness coming through. She's got an amazing story. And I only learned about her because I was on an unexpected layover in Leiden in the Netherlands. And while I was stuck there because of travel chaos, I just went looking for women in Leiden history and found this story. Huyemi means good Maria, and she was a nurse in the poor neighborhoods of Leiden in the 1800s. And everybody loved her because even if you couldn't afford to pay a nurse, you knew you could call Huyemi and she would come and she would take care of you. So beloved by everyone. Long story short, she was poisoning them all with arsenic and had life insurance policies on all of them. And she poisoned at least 90, maybe 100 plus people in the city of Leiden. She got away with it for about 3 years. But the end of her illustrious reign as a poisoner coincided with the birth of forensic science, when they figured out that you could do a chemical analysis of the organs of dead people and you could see if they died of arsenic poisoning. You could find evidence of arsenic, and that was in the end her undoing. And her court case was infamous all over the world, of this incredible woman. Why did she do it? What motivated her? I mean, she had life insurance on all them, and she presumably was making a ton of money, but she didn't use the money. She lived in squalor with the rest of the poor people in Leiden. An amazing and fascinating, dark episode in Dutch history. But I guess Huyemi, she's a good example of the reality that women are not just one thing, that women aren't just inspiring, that they're not just trailblazers, that women's history means all the women in history, and we're just as varied as all other humans, all the male humans in the world. And so I think women's history has got to branch out and do all the women, all the villains, all the people who failed, all the women who were wrong by our modern standards. And once we're telling the stories of all the women and from all the different perspectives, I think then we're going to have a much more balanced and nuanced story. Here's another great villain in history, depending on your perspective. Who was responsible for the downfall of the Mexica Aztec Empire? Okay, you got your guess in your mind. She has 3 or 4 different names, so any of them will do. But nowadays we know her by presumably her native given name, Malintzin, also known as Doña Maria or La Malinche in Mexico. An amazing character, fascinating. When I first learned about her, interviewing Jeff Ritchie at Weber State, I mean, I was angry that I hadn't heard of her before, even having taught world history for years. So this is the famous scene of Cortez meeting Montezuma, and here is Malintzin. She's in every image of the story of the conquest, especially those that are drawn by native peoples. Malintzin is there right next to Cortez. She's usually larger than him. She's pointing, she's speaking. And that's because Malintzin was a native woman who was enslaved. She was given to the conquistadors as like a peace offering when they very first arrived among the Chantal Maya. But she seized her moment. She recognized immediately that this Spanish technology was nothing that anybody in what's now Mexico had ever seen. And she became a translator. She had a gift for languages. She spoke multiple dialects. She spoke Nahuatl, which is the language of the Aztecs. She spoke Maya, and then she picked up Spanish incredibly quickly. So she became Cortez's translator. And if textbooks mention her, that's how they speak about her. But in fact, she was the mastermind. She was literally the only person on the entire American continent who understood the stakes, who understood what everybody was saying. And she's translating not just words, but entire cultural concepts. You know, like Cortez is saying things like, I'm here as a representative of the King of Spain, who has the blessing of the Pope, who is, God's representative on earth. Say that, and she has to try to explain all of these things. But she's not just translating, as we now know. She is choosing how she's going to share these messages. She's changing the meaning sometimes. And she masterminded the conquest of the Aztec Empire. She was absolutely behind the entire thing. She saved Cortez and all the other Spaniards' lives many times. They absolutely, in my opinion, they would have died right out of the gate if not for Malincine. This woman and Cortez together are responsible for the downfall, the utter destruction of the empire. Oh, because I'm running out of time, I can't tell you about Zazel Ha down south. She's on the other flip side of the story where she saved the Maya in the Yucatan Peninsula at the same time. So it makes for such an interesting story of how did the Americas end up like this. And with Utah as a part of the story, I think we often don't talk about how Utah was Spain for 300 years and then it was Mexico. And this is all a part of our story also, if we tie our story to the geography of the place or to the land itself. It's all part of such a sweeping narrative that never really made sense. But when you include these two women, Zazel Ha, who's saving the Maya in the south, and Malincine, who's conquering the entire Aztec Empire in the north, then, and both of them married to Spanish men, it makes the story much more nuanced and less good guys and bad guys, but more just like an epic sweeping story is happening where women are on all the sides and women are involved in all the conflicts and they have all the ideas. They're not just the good guys and they're not, they are as right as much as they are wrong. In all the stories, there are women everywhere. Okay. We don't have time for this. That's in the book. We could do a personality test to match you with an ancient empire if you want. We can do it during question time if you want to. If you want to find out which ancient empire you most matches your groove, I just pulled it from the book. Okay, but my fourth point, these last two are fairly quick. The stakes aren't as high as they feel. And I think that's what the gift that world history gives me on a daily basis. Having the long view of the human story puts today in perspective and helps us to realize that the only constant is change. Change is always happening. And in hindsight, even the biggest changes in the history of the world it doesn't end the story. It dramatically redirects the story, but it's not the end of the story. The stakes are never as high as they feel. For example, this was the borders of the world for many centuries before the borders that we have now. I mean, massive, massive shifts have happened over the course of our history and will keep happening. One example is Margaret Clitheroe. It was a woman who lived through times that felt like very high stakes to her. But in hindsight, we're like, really? Was it really that big of a deal? Margaret Clitheroe was a secret Catholic in Protestant England during Elizabeth's reign. She was hiding priests in priest holes, and we probably know about this episode in history. So she's a part of this sort of underground network, which is hiding Catholics. And the differences between Catholic and Protestant felt so important. They felt like life or death, whether you believe that the Pope intercedes with God or whether he doesn't, that was the most important thing in the world. Well, here's another little bit of trivia. In the Tudor era, if you were to be executed as a heretic by crushing, what symbolic item was used in your execution? Got your guess in your head? They would use your own front door, take it off of your house and use it to crush you. And that's what happened to Margaret Clitheroe. She was given an out by the judge many times and she refused to take it, and choosing instead to die a martyr because it mattered so much to her. And in hindsight, when I'm explaining this Catholic Protestant conflict to students, they're often like, why did they think that was such a huge deal? And I often wonder what people in the future will ask that about us. People in the future will look at us and say, why did they think that was such a huge deal? What did they get really worked up about? Right now, I'm working on an episode set during the Black Death, and it's going to come out in a couple of days. Now, that was an apocalyptic time. I mean, that was some really heavy stuff that happened, and the stakes felt high to them at the time. But even I was thinking about how we talk about the Black Death, we talk about these huge social shifts. But we don't feel the stakes now as high as they felt them back then. But even so, my episode is about this mystic, Julian of Norwich, an anchorite in Norwich. Her number one takeaway in her life of mystic experience was all shall be well. It's all love, and everything's fine, and we are all God. And that she came to that conclusion in the midst of the Black Death is so amazing to me. She's a great character to pull out of that story, because she spent her life contemplating what does it all mean, and she came to a conclusion which was so the opposite of what you might think someone would believe coming out the other side of the Black Death. Okay, last trivia. How many people have already lived out their stories on planet Earth? The number is about 100 billion. 100 billion people have already lived out there, every single one of them, an amazing and unique story. Every single person lived and died and passed the baton and set up the plot for us that we are living now. This plot isn't just our creation. This is the whole human story. And the story's been going on for a really, really long time. And we are the most recent chapter in it, but we are only a chapter in something that's much, much bigger than us. So that's what I love about history. This is my fifth and final takeaway. I think history is a mine of truths and stories and lessons people have learned that we can return to again and again. It's basically an endless pool because so many lives have already been lived. We can dip into it again and again and again. We could write another history of the world in 80 lost women and choose 80 different women, and the story would be different and enlightening in new ways and have amazing new arc. And that's what's so beautiful about doing history. As historians, all I think we already know this, but there's so much richness, so much human life and experience to benefit from the more that we dig into the lives that have been lived in the past. Again, our most incredible creation is our collective story that we're all telling, that we're all living as we go. Okay, that's it. Okay, sorry, 5 minutes over, but we still have time for questions, I suppose. If you want, Catherine, I think you could put them in the chat.
Yes, thank you so much, Katie. I loved thinking about these lessons, and especially in the context of the stories that you shared. Thank you for your wisdom and for distilling those lessons that you've learned down into those manageable bites. And I think we might have to go back for the which empire you are quiz in just a minute here.
Fun.
Just a reminder that folks can put things into the chat or into the Q&A box if you have any questions for Katie. And I'm going to start off with this one, which is, I'm sure that you have many favorite women in history. It's probably hard to choose, but is there someone whose story really changed how you see history or yourself, or somebody really meaningful to you at the moment?
Oh, yeah, that's hard because it's literally every episode that I make, because I've spent usually about 2 months working for each episode doing these deep dives into this woman's life, and every time that woman teaches me something new, some kind of big profound truth, in trying to find what's universal about her and her experience that we can all relate to. I learn amazing new lessons every time, and I think that's why I'll never stop doing the podcast, because it's like going to school. I'm in the school of these women's lives, and get to see things through their eyes and learn what they learned, which often is things I would never think of. If I had a favorite, I might have to choose Emily du Châtelet. Her story is bonkers. And the short version is she's raised in the court of Louis XIV, but she loves books and she doesn't care about fashion and beauty. And so she has to finagle a way to buy her own books and educate herself, even when everybody is telling her, don't let a man see you reading books or you'll never get a husband. And she figures out how to count cards, and she wins in gambling at the court of Louis XIV, and then uses the money to buy books so she can educate herself. She goes on to be one of the great minds of the Enlightenment. She really opened the door for the Enlightenment by reading this obscure and unreadable text by this guy named Isaac Newton. And he says he's inventing this new kind of mathematics called calculus. She read it and she said, "Oh my gosh, this is huge. I don't think anybody's going to know because his Latin is impenetrable and his math is overly complicated. But if we made it understandable to people, this could change the world." And so she did. She spent her entire life translating Newton into a readable text and simplifying his math so that it wasn't impenetrable. And of course, we know that that changed the world. Plus, her life story is just so, I just feel so deeply connected to her. And we've taken women's history tours to her remote chateau in the Champagne region of France, where you can just feel her spunky spirit. So I love her.
I love that. Thank you for sharing. Oh, we have a question here saying that they're from Michigan, but will be visiting Utah in a few weeks. Do you have one or two museums or historical sites they should try to visit?
Oh, depends where in Utah you are, of course. I mean, you could go full Wild West with the mining towns around Helper if you wanted in central Utah. You could hit all the national parks in the south. If you're up north, you absolutely have to go to Golden Spike National Monument. Or is it a park now? Did it become a park? It's either a monument or a park. Anyway, Golden Spike is one of the biggest moments in American and world history. You can't go wrong in Utah. No matter where you go, there's amazing things. There's a cinnamon roll museum in, where is it? In southern Utah. I've been there. It was amazing. All the obscure museums are my favorite. I love a good museum about nothing, about something that nobody ever cares about. I will go there instantly. I love those.
Those are great recommendations. And to this person with a question, if you come back next year in 2026 after May, you'll have a Utah Historical Society museum to visit, and the Museum of Utah that will
Yes.
open on the State Capitol
Yes.
complex, which won't be the only place, but will be one place to learn about Utah's story.
Long
Um,
awaited, long overdue. Yes, I'm
for
so
sure.
excited about that.
Well, Katie, thanks for sharing your wealth of knowledge and your excitement and passion. We have a question about, so while putting the book together, everything changes from the beginning to the end of a project. Was there something that surprised you or something that you had to change or rework, or, how did the story change from when you conceived of the project to the final product?
Yeah, great question. That sounds like a question that was asked by somebody who's written a book. So I know how it goes. But yeah, so we had our initial list of 80 women, which the publishers asked for at the beginning so they could use it, to sell the book and send it out for promotion and stuff. And then the list kept changing as we went. And it would involve things like, as we're writing, there are these common threads that appear through the book, like, oh, we have the early Brazilian stories. Now we should return to Brazil at the end and see how it's developed over time. And, we're focusing on Abyssinia here. So it was a lot of like, now that we can see the threads that are going through it, we need to add somebody else so that we can resolve the story or add somebody at the beginning. So yeah, we were constantly emailing the editor and saying, change in the list. Now this one's out, this one's in. And it was painful. It was always painful. Who are you going to pull out and who you're going to put in? But one of the more remarkable things was we pulled somebody out. I probably shouldn't say who. And then they revealed the cover and she was on the cover. And so we were like, oh, I guess we better put her back in. So, but yeah, I guess that's it. In the end, this selection of women changed constantly because we wanted persistent stories. It's not just a random book of women, not just like here are totally disconnected stories, but we wanted to tell one big overarching narrative. And so that led to what we selected and what we left out. But I would love to start again and see what would happen if I started with completely 80 different women. How might that story turn out?
Absolutely. And that is one of the things that I appreciated about the book was those through lines that connected me through to all of the stories that I hadn't heard before. Um, Thanks for that. We've got one last question here, and then I would love to turn some time back over to you to take us through that last trivia or matching up with the empires if you'd like. But what would you like to research and write about next? I mean, I'm sure you're working on many podcast episodes as well at a time, but is there something that you'd really like to dive into?
Yeah, I have a lot of ideas there. It's a lot of, as a world historian, one of the things that I think is so fun is to just look at the whole history of the world with different lenses on. So I guess I've already done it with sisters and then toilets and pirates is what's coming out next. So yeah, I'm mulling the different possibilities for what would be a fascinating lens through which to view the whole history of the world. I would love to write about pets who changed history because there's so many great stories. But another thing I find myself constantly being obsessed with is the stories of my own ancestors who came to Utah through all different paths. And the more I trace those lines out, the more I see a global history. You know, these people came from across this ocean, and these people came from across this ocean. How did they all end up here in Utah? And so that is nagging at me also, that a sort of family biography is actually a global history, especially for people with roots in Utah. We often, our story is global in scale. So who knows is my real answer.
We'll be watching for it either way. Now, we'd love to let you take us back to the
Okay,
pieces you skipped over.
let's do it. It's
The folks who
fast.
are still on here at the end can end your lunch break with a little bit of fun.
Find out which ancient empire you most match with. So this is in the book. Sometimes, when you're talking about big overarching movements, it can be boring, but I've found in teaching, if I make it personal, then it's very interesting. So here's your personality quiz. Okay. So everybody just choose which one of these best matches your groove. And we're going to figure out which ancient empire you are. Okay. So these are your options: epic battles, but make it fashion; political scheming and sabotage. Sounds fun. Democracy. Oh, yeah. Citizen power. Give me tolerance and diversity, or give me death. Or give me one unified way of life, or give me death. I'd like to rage against the machine, please. Let's just be so scary no one bothers us. Less patriarchy, more elephant. More patriarchy, less elephant. Or the important thing is connecting people to each other. Okay, so do a little bit of soul searching. Pick which one of these, which one really truly is your vibe. There's no right or wrong answer, really. You're just going to find out which ancient empire you are. Okay, are you ready? All right, here's your results. If you chose epic battles but make it fashion, you're Shang Dynasty China. That is some intense stuff. Read about it. Political scheming and sabotage, you're ancient Egypt. Democracy, ancient Athens, of course, although if you're a woman, it's going to turn out real bad. Give me tolerance and diversity, or give me death, you're ancient Persia. One unified way of life, or give me death, you're early Christian in ancient Rome. If you'd like to rage against the machine, please, you're ancient Palmyra. If you want to just be so scary no one bothers you, you're ancient Meroe, which is in Africa. Less patriarchy, more elephant, you're ancient Vietnam. More patriarchy, less elephant, you are Han Dynasty China, who is going to go up against ancient Vietnam, of course. And the final one, the important thing is connecting people to each other. Then you are ancient Maya. The person who built the very first road in the Americas was a Maya queen, Shkawil, and that very first road still exists in Coba. You can bike through the rainforest and go and stand on the first road in the Americas. Anyway, so now you know something a little bit more about yourself and which ancient empire. You should maybe do some Googling and find out why you are the way you are.
So we have a lot of tens coming through in the chat, and one with 6 or 7 and a 1. So looks like we've
Oh,
got some connectors here.
cool. Oh, good. Somebody chose Be So Scary No One Bothers Us. That's fabulous.
That's good. Right? Thank you, folks. Thanks to everybody for joining. And just as a reminder, these talks are recorded, so this will be up on our YouTube for the Utah Historical Society on our channel in a few weeks. And you can also see past talks there and as well. Take a look at the links that we shared in the chat to catch Katie's podcast and her books and check out what she's doing. And then, Katie, I'd love to end on this invitation you have.
Yeah, I just remembered that this is hot off the press. We've just settled it that What's Her Name podcast will be partnering with Better Days 2020 to have a night of celebration of putting women back into history. And it's sort of to launch our book, but it's more like a book festival, a celebration of books and art, where there will be local authors of women's history, and artists, many participating in a night of poetry and song and reading, and then followed by a festival with book signings, so you can meet all the authors and you could buy all the books and have them signed by everyone, and meet all the great local artists we have, everybody who's working in the field of women's history. So we are going to have that April 17th at, of course, the Clubhouse Ladies Literary Club, established 1877, in Salt Lake City. So yeah, put that on your calendar, and we'll have more information coming out.
Thank you so much, Katie. We appreciate you sharing your expertise and your wisdom and your passion for these stories. It was a really fun
Thanks.
hour to
Thanks for
spend with
having
you.
me.